Hi modelers. In this video I go over the first stages to assembling the forksole and forward well deck details that I did. This is part 20 of my Trumpeter 1 to 200 scale Titanic build series. Now in this video, when I refer to the forksole, I will be using the term bow to make the nomenclature a little simpler. The next few videos I'm going to cover how I assembled some of the details for the bow and the forward well deck. First up was to make the Pontos metal box that the Pontos metal forward mast sits in. Now this is found on the Pontos instructions on page 4. The metal box assembly is made up of two boxes. There's a small box and then there's a big box, and this small box sits inside the little box. And this is designed to help maintain the right angle at which the forward mast is going to sit into those boxes. The problem is that if one pushes the mast into the box too hard after everything is glued in place, you have the chance of pushing this mast down into the boxes and dislodging them from either the bow deck here or dislodging the little box from inside the big box, and that will create a problem, especially if everything's glued together. You won't be able to get back at to it. So to solve this problem, I create a solid foundation for the forward mast to anchor into. I did two things. First, to secure the small box that sits inside the bigger box, I drilled 4 small holes on the sides of the big box. Then I cut a paper clip to the size and ran it through the big box so that the paper clip rod provides a firm support so that the little box inside cannot move and be pushed down. This way, I now have two systems keeping the little box in place inside the big box: the super glue and the paper clip rods. The next problem is that the big box itself can be dislodged from underneath the bow deck because there's a little bit of space between the bottom of the box and the C deck here that sits underneath where the box sits. So if you push too hard, again, this box will get pushed down away from underneath the bow deck. So to keep the big box from possibly breaking loose, I made a spacer out of two 4.04 inch pieces of plastic, and I did some minor sanding to get the right thickness so that when the box is glued in place underneath the bow deck, it will sit secure against this deck here, and you won't be able to push it down any further. So with these two solutions, one should not be able to dislodge the metal boxes if one pushes the mast too hard into the boxes. Now, one other thing to remember too when fitting this box and mast together is that the Pontos instructions tell you have to make this hole a little bit larger than when it is how it comes with the kit. And then you might also have to kind of fine-tune this hole at a slight angle. Instead of it being drilled straight down, you will have to kind of do some sanding at an angle, because when I first put the box together underneath the deck here in a dry fit, it wouldn't go in all the way. Kind of would get hung up, and it was because the hole was drilled square like this, and this mast sits at an angle. So you'll have to take a sander and make that a little at a different angle. So with this fitted together, you can just take that mast and it just slips right in place. It bottoms out and it just sits just at the right angle as designed by these boxes. And now if it's in the model and you push a little too hard, nothing will get pushed loose. So not only does the box bottom out on the sea deck, but so will the mast. So the mast won't go down too far. You can see here I pushed it and it broke loose. So that won't happen now with this kind of modification that I made to the box. So just something to keep in mind when if you're going to use the Pontos kits and use their parts. Now I found another interesting, I don't know if you want to call it an error or just something that's different, but when adding the capstans to the bow, the forward two sit at a different location on the Pontos wood decking than on the original model deck. So I had to drill some holes to make the capstans fit in these locations. Just something to keep in mind when you're using the Pontos kit. Next up was making the anchor chain handling equipment. Now, these parts are found on page 10 of the Pontos instruction booklet, and that comprises all of this right here. So this whole thing I just call the anchor chain handling equipment. Now again, one has to deal with some tiny parts. The first thing to do was to deburr the parts numbers D34. Now there are 16 per side, and then they are glued to part B35 and B36. Now while that project was drying, I made some boxes that the windlass sit on. Now that's these little boxes here. There's one on each side, and then the windlass, this round little thing here, sits on top of those boxes. Now once the boxes were made, I could assemble the windlass components and glue them to the boxes. After the boxes and windlass components were glued together, I painted them shamrock green. Now some people will paint them black, but if you take a look at the website titanic-cad-plans.com, he has an article explaining that it is most likely that those windlasses were painted green, just like the capstans were and some of the other machinery. Now, once that was done, I was ready to glue F17, what I call the anchor chain tray, and that's basically that's this right here, the tray. I call it the tray. That's this long piece here, and that sits right on top of these D34 pieces here. Now, I had to hope that when I put these trays on top of those little D34 pieces that they all lined up in the slots that were in F17. So that seemed to work okay. Now while that was drying, I noticed that the holes in the bow deck did not line up with the anchor chain equipment assembly. So that's these holes here that are in the deck, they didn't seem to kind of line up with the Pontos parts. So basically I just filled them with putty and then re-drilled and sanded the holes to match the Pontos chain assembly. Next I made the housing assembly where the chains will run down into the deck below. That's this area right here, and let's call this component the windlass hatch. Now the hardest part making this windlass hatch was to bend the flat part G37 and G36, and they turn into this little round piece here. I just used the round part of the file here to kind of help mold that and make a round shape for it. And then once I did that, I just glued the parts to make it up the windlass hatch together. The final step in making the anchor chain assembly equipment was to assemble the front sections where the chain would go down into the deck below and out to the sides of the hull. So that's these little contraptions here, and they sit right on top of this metal piece here in the Pontos parts. Now, let's call this section the chain controller section. Now again, the hardest part was to bend the small straight G41 piece into the right curved shape. Now that's this piece right here. And you got to get that just right so it fits in between those two parts and lines up just right. Now once assembled, I glued the chain controller section to the anchor chain handling equipment assembly. So I just took this and glued it right down on this assembly here. Now that the anchor chain assembly or handling equipment was ready for painting, I just used flat black and just used an airbrush to spray this whole complex. And basically the total time that it took to do all of this work amounted to about 6 hours. So it took a while to do, but it turned out pretty good. So in the next video, I'll present more of the detailing of the bow deck. And until that time, have a great day.